Good afternoon, Chamber members. For those of you I have not met yet, my name is Sabrina Binkley, Head of School at Spruce Tree Montessori and past Chair of the Fairbanks Chamber Board of Directors. I'd like to take a moment, as we do each week, to thank our executive partners whose logos you saw on the screen before we began our program today. These businesses provide a rock-solid foundation for the Fairbanks Chamber to be successful throughout the year, and their support is not only financial. These businesses share knowledge and experience that help shape and direct our advocacy efforts and create awareness that drives economic strength and growth for interior Alaska. A full list of our partners can be found on our website. I would also like to give a big thank you to GCI, not only for powering our new virtual platform, but for being the sponsor of our Diversity and Inclusion series that we are kicking off today. Thank you so much, GCI. Now I'd like to welcome Brenna online to help us recognize our new and renewing members. Brenna?
All right, just making sure I was actually live. I couldn't see my little photo. But hello, everyone. I'm here to welcome 2 new members to today's chamber meeting, and that is the USO Fort Wainwright, as well as the Fairbanks Children's Museum. So welcome to the Fairbanks Chamber. We're very excited to have you on board. We'd also like to thank our renewing executive partner, Usabelli Coal Mine, based out of Healy. And then we'd also like to thank our renewing members, starting with the Law Office of Rita T. Ali, Linda Holbert with New York Life Insurance, American Tire and Auto, and John Ringstad. We'd also like to welcome some of our renewing members to our 110% Club, which means that these members went above and beyond their membership dues to help us with our advocacy actions. And today we're welcoming Birchwood Homes to that group, along with Dean and Associates, La Quinta Inn and Suites, Glacier Point Services, Markwood Realty, and Yukon Accounting and Consulting. Thank you for joining the 110% Club this week. And today's membership minute focuses on the gift of membership. So, like I said before, we welcome the Fairbanks Children's Museum back today, and that's due in part to Usabelli Coal Mine gifting them the gift of membership. So if there's a small business or nonprofit that you just love or has just broken into the new business community, feel free to reach out and gift them a chamber membership so that they can have a seat at the table and be involved as well. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or any of the other chamber staff here in the office. All right, back to you, Sabrina.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Brenna. Yesterday, our board of directors met to hear from the second speaker in our series on the state of Alaska's budget and revenue. The board is doing our homework to understand the revenue issue better so we can engage productively in the state's ongoing budget debate. The Alaska Legislature's session started last week, January 19th, and our Government Relations Committee has already been hard at work reviewing newly filed bills. They will continue to track new legislation, which might impact our members here in Fairbanks, but you can also suggest bills you'd like us to track. Check out the Legislative Watch section of our weekly Monday newsletters or the legislative tracking page on our website to see what we're tracking so far. And now it's time for Janelle's President and CEO report. Janelle?
Okay, there I am. I think we've got a little bit of a delay. We're all learning to work with it. Okay, so I know that we have some attendees joining us today who are new to this online Hopin platform. So I wanted to very briefly run through some of the essential navigation options that you have to move around our virtual event space. You'll want to check out the buttons on the left-hand side of your screen. You can click on the networking button to be randomly matched with another networking attendee for a brief chat. It's actually a lot more fun and less awkward than it sounds, and there is a timer, so you will not get stuck in a conversation you do not want to be in. If you prefer to network in a larger group rather than one-on-one, you can also click on the sessions button. You can invite other attendees to join your specific session to have a group chat. You can also click on the Expo button to view a virtual Expo booth space and consider this as a future marketing opportunity for your business. And probably the most essential area on your screen is the chat section on the right. This is where you can type any questions for our presenters today. You can also send a private chat to any other event attendee if you would normally walk up to them when we're in person and say hi, you can do that through the chat. You could also invite them to a private video chat after the presentation if you wanted to catch up with them in a little bit more depth. And if someone has sent you a chat, the way that you will know that, it won't pop up and interrupt the presentation, but you'll see a little red dot at the top of the chat section that'll let you know someone has sent a chat. So be sure to take time after the presentation to click around and explore, since we're pretty excited about the opportunities that this new platform provides. On a related topic, I would also like to personally invite you to our virtual Juneau Fly-In event. That'll be February 16th through the 18th of this year. So normally we fly down to Juneau with a small group of our members who learn about how our state government really works, and they get to share the Fairbanks Chamber's priority issues with our legislators, our government officials, and the people who really keep our state running. Like everything else this year, the Juneau Fly-In will look different in 2021, but we hope this allows many more of our members to participate. The reason it's related to Hopin is that the event will take place in this Hopin platform, and that will allow us to hold multiple meetings at the same time, as well as having bigger presentations where we have a number of people attending. So we hope that you'll be able to commit to just 2-hour blocks of time. We do not expect you to be here for the whole 3 days, just 2-hour blocks of time. And in each block, you'll meet with about 3 or 4 different legislators or government officials. So registration is open now on our website. So please let us know when you can join us. We also want to remember to thank our fly-in sponsors for this year. So we've got Hillcorp Alaska, Kinross Fort Knox, Mac Federal Credit Union, PDC Engineers, Ukukti Consulting, and Usabelli Coal Mine. So we're grateful to them for their continued support of our members as we advocate for all of our needs of the businesses here in the interior of Alaska. If you're interested in getting involved or you have any questions, you can always email Katie at fairbankschamber.org. And finally, we are looking for 2 new members to join our staff team here at the Fairbanks Chamber. We have 2 open positions, which are posted on our website. There's Advocacy Program Manager and Marketing and Communications Coordinator. So you can click the big blue Join Our Team banner right on our homepage to learn more about those positions or to fill out an application. We're looking for some cool people to join the team, so please help us spread the word and be sure to apply if you are that person. You can find details about all of our upcoming events and anything we've mentioned here today on our website at fairbankschamber.org. Back to you, Sabrina.
Thanks, Janelle. Now for our main presentation. Last year, amidst the broad uncertainty of our changing world, our board of directors started a conversation about how the Fairbanks Chamber should address the topic of diversity and inclusion in a business context. Knowing that our highly reputable organization had not formally tackled this issue in the past, we recognize that the events we all witnessed in Alaska and beyond last year provided an opportunity for us to bring greater awareness to this important topic to the forefront of our community education and advocacy work. Last year, we added a diversity and inclusion scholarship for our Leadership Fairbanks program, but we knew we wanted to do more. So we prepared to launch a monthly presentation series in 2021. You might remember our Unmasking Behavioral Health series from 2 summers ago. Well, this diversity and inclusion series will follow roughly the same template, engaging presenters exploring this topic from a variety of angles, including actionable steps you can take in your business. This year, on the 4th Tuesday of each month, starting today, our weekly business presentation will address this topic as it relates to business, our community, and our state. We couldn't think of a more fitting opening to set the tone of this series than the W.K. Kellogg Foundation's report, titled The Business Case for Racial Equity. And we are pleased to have its author, Ani Turner, as well as the Foundation's own Cynthia Muller, here to present to us today. Ani Turner is co-director of Sustainable Health Spending Strategies, where she studies drivers of health spending and the economic impact of investments in social and environmental factors that determine health and life outcomes. She leads Altarum's monthly tracking of national health sector employment and has 2 decades of experience in health workforce modeling and analysis. Working with government and commercial clients for more than 25 years, Ms. Turner has developed forecasting models and conducted analyses of healthcare resources, costs, and quality for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the U.S. Department of Defense, individual states, and even individual health plans. Current foundation-funded research supports both the improvement of the health of underserved people in Detroit and the making of the business case for investments in greater racial equality. Ms. Turner holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics, summa cum laude, and a Master of Arts degree in applied economics with a concentration in labor economics, both from the University of Michigan. Cynthia Muller is the Director of Mission Investment at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation based in Battle Creek, Michigan. Muller is responsible for driving the strategy and performance of the Foundation's $100 million mission-driven investments portfolio. She also oversees the Foundation's $60 million program-related investment portfolio and managing strategic impact investment activities that address systematic barriers that create vulnerable conditions for historically marginalized communities and children. Cynthia came to the Foundation in September 2016 as the Program and Portfolio Officer, where she was responsible for developing and managing strategic market rate impact investment activities, sourcing and deploying market rate investments to increase social change impact, analyzing solutions and trends, and developing relationships in the field. Prior to joining the Foundation, Muller developed and managed Arabella Advisors Impact Investing Practice, where she helped foundations and individuals understand the field of impact investing. She developed strategies and structure investments to accomplish their social and environmental goals. Ms. Muller previously worked in development finance as well as community-based healthcare in Indigenous communities. She serves on boards of Next Chapter, Enterprise Loan Fund, and Mission Investors Exchange. Muller was born in Anchorage and raised in Chugiak. She holds a Master of Business Administration from the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Stanford. Thank you so much, Ani and Cynthia, for joining us today. Take it away.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Sabrina, and thanks, Janelle, for the introduction. And it's great to see, well, not to see, but to be with many folks from home. I'm Cynthia Muller. I'm the Director of Mission-Driven Investments here at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. We are a 90-year-old private foundation that was founded by serial entrepreneur Will Keith Kellogg. And Mr. Kellogg left us quite a legacy as an institution. But one that is really resonating, obviously, in this moment is around racial equity. Way back when Mr. Kellogg had his company in Battle Creek, he was always fervent about making sure that all communities, despite race, were able to get resources to support their ability to thrive. And so we still take that in through a lot of the work that we do here at the foundation, and most notably the work that we've been doing over the last 25 years in racial equity. And just to define racial equity, when we talk about racial equity, it's around the aspiration of racial equality. Within that is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, some of these other really fascinating conversations that are coming up around implicit bias. And so when we talk about racial equity, we are referring to some of the practices in DEI, but overarchingly, we're really talking about inequality. We're talking about how systematically, unfortunately, our society and our systems have inadvertently and sometimes intentionally left communities out in a couple of different ways. And so through our work at the foundation, in supporting racial equity, I lead our capital market strategy and really looking at how do we start to make drive more incentives for investment that ensure that individuals, underrepresented communities are engaged in a systematic way. So for instance, we here in Alaska, for instance, we know that there's a shortage of community development financial institutions up there and lending institutions that are focused on community needs outside of banks, where they can do a lot of the higher touch transactions that required subordinated capital. And so we think about how we can start to influence that. And with this business case for racial equity, it really helped us to really identify where those opportunities lie. And so Ani, my incredible colleague who wrote this report, is going to talk to you about it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing as a result of the report. And so we hope that this is helpful and really look forward to the questions at the end of the session. So Ani, I'm going to turn it to you.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. Thanks, Cynthia. Again, I'm Ani Turner. I am with Altarum. Altarum is a nonprofit research organization that is focused primarily on health and improving the health of everyone, and that gets into drivers of health. And so we have been very, very pleased over the past almost decade to partner with the Kellogg Foundation on the business case for racial equity. And as you heard from my bio, I have a very analytical, quantitative background. My team is economists and data analysts and policy analysts. And so what we wanted to do with this work is look at racial equity and understand that this is a matter of social justice and the right thing to do, but there is also a very strong case for the private sector, for the business community, and for economic growth to pay attention to racial equity and to advancing equity in our society. So this slide just shows some of the early work that we did back in 2013. We put out the first business case for racial equity. We updated that work in 2018, and those are the numbers I'm going to talk to you about today. But I just wanted to make it clear that this work is part of a whole body of work that the Kellogg Foundation has commissioned, some of it more specifically even focused on within a business organization, what kinds of processes can you look at and do to make sure that you're using an equity lens? These are some of the examples. Next slide, please. This is what our reports look like. We have a business case for racial equity for the country. We did some targeted work in a number of locations where the foundation has invested. And many other groups, I want to point out, have lots and lots of data and information on everything from statistical metropolitan areas to states. And there's just a very growing body of data and analysis looking at disparities and tracking progress and looking at gaps and looking at initiatives at all geographic levels. Next slide. So I mentioned that we were the economists and the analysts. I want to highlight that we were joined in this work really over the past 9 years by a number of nationally recognized scholars in racial equity and data and initiatives in progress, including specifically the folks here on this list, as well as for the place-based studies, policy and data experts in each one of those locations. And so I want to really acknowledge and extend appreciation to all of these folks who also played a large part in these reports. Next slide. So Cynthia has already addressed this, but we want to be clear, what do we mean when we talk about advancing racial equity, or what would a racially equitable society look like, or a community, or a state, or a country? And we say that we've achieved racial equity when a person's opportunity and life outcomes are not strongly determined by their race or their ethnic background. And as an analyst, what I would like to see, to know that we are getting closer to an equitable society, is when I look at people's health and people's incomes and likelihood of incarceration and opportunities for financing and entrepreneurship and net worth. I would expect to see a range of outcomes in a population, in the country, say. Some people wealthier than others, healthier than others, different life expectancies, but we would not expect to see significant and persistent differences between groups if opportunity were available equally. And unfortunately, that is what we see today, very significant and stubbornly persistent differences in these life outcomes. Next slide. One of the main goals of this work is to broaden the conversation around racial equity, again, from being a very important social justice goal to recognizing that it is also an important driver of business and economic growth to advance racial equity. We know that we did not get to where we are today by accident. There were laws, there were practices, there were policies that were specifically based on race, specifically racist or discriminatory, and we're not going to alleviate generations of different paths in life by just saying, well, laws have changed and it's no longer legal to force people to be in different schools, et cetera, and therefore, it all should balance out. We're where we are today on purpose, and we need to be proactive in undoing those generations of impacts. But we want to make the case that greater racial equity is critical to the workforce, to really allowing all people to reach their potential, to having a more skilled and healthier workforce, to having the potential to increase consumer markets and consumer spending, to strengthen our communities, greater stability, greater financial stability. And we know that we're an aging population, and that's going to increase the pressure on state, federal, local budgets. And so again, it's very important to invest in especially the parts of the population that we know are growing fastest in our country, which are primarily populations of color, who have historically had the greatest constraints and are starting from places of disadvantage. Next slide. Thanks. So we know that we're looking at a situation that is the outcome of many decades, if not hundreds of years of policies and practices. And this slide is showing a metric that was put together by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. It's an index that's a combination of various measures that have been found to contribute to children's success in life. And they call it an opportunity index. At the time we published our report, this was 2018, this is what the numbers look like. Out of a total of potential 1,000, which would be the best possible opportunity, the average score for white children in the US was 704 out of 1,000. And you can see the dramatic difference between that score and Hispanic Latino children, American Indian or Alaska Native children, and Black or African American children. on the order of half of the opportunity. Next slide. So what are some of those domains of opportunity that would go into an index of opportunity like that? In our report, we show actual data points that measure where we are today in a number of measures of children being born into poverty, of health, likelihood of incarceration, access to banking, home ownership, education, all of the things on these lists. And I'm not going to put a bunch of facts and figures in front of you now. They are in our reports and many other places. But I do want to highlight the first bullet and the last bullet on this slide. The first bullet, children of color in the United States and in every place that we've studied are much more likely to be born in poverty, but in particular into neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And it makes sense. And in fact, the research has shown over and over that when you have a concentration of poverty, and again, the research shows by concentration, we mean at least 20% of families are also living under the federal poverty level, then you have a set of circumstances that really has a significant effect on life outcomes. And if you look at the little graphic there that I've shown here, the bar chart, this metric shows the percent of children in the US that are born into a neighborhood of concentrated poverty. And this particular metric actually is 30% or more of families in those neighborhoods are living in poverty. And you can see for Black children and American Indian and Alaskan Native children, about a third of children in the US are born into concentrated poverty, almost a quarter of Hispanic or Latino, and about 5% of white children. So there, of course, are many poor white children in the United States, but they are more likely to be born and living in a neighborhood where there is a greater mix of socioeconomic status. And what that means for opportunity is if you're born into a neighborhood of concentrated poverty, there's just fewer resources for schools and extracurriculars, and the community is less able to support businesses and opportunities for job experience, and on and on. And this metric in particular, I think, is indicative of many decades of housing policy and, again, outright racist as well as discriminatory practices that have created, of course, with the American Indian and Native populations, as well as other populations, pockets of concentrated poverty, which make it very difficult to break out of that cycle of poverty and affects education, employment, and so many other things. The last bullet on this slide talks about earnings. And the way that we have translated all of these types of disparities into overall economic impacts is to use earnings as a combined economic measure of the impacts of all of these types of differences. And so the combination of differences in health, differences in employment opportunities, ability to get funding for a business, a chance of being incarcerated, all of these things are reflected in a person's earnings at each age. And so we've looked at the data over many years and compared earnings, average earnings for a non-Hispanic white person at a particular age and sex with people of color and disaggregated amongst different categories or populations. And what we see is that people of color today in the United States earn about 2/3 as much as their white age-sex counterparts. Those are the averages. And so that is a tremendous loss in economic potential. It's a combination of lower employment rates and differences in the types of jobs that people have, greater incarceration, greater illness, different education levels, etc. But the combination of those things creates a very significant earnings differential. And we also know that the net worth or overall wealth differential is many, many times more greater than that. There's a 10-to-1 differential. So financially, when we look at the chance for upward mobility, when we look at the ability to engage in consumer spending, et cetera, there are just very big differences due to all of these disparities in all of these domains of life. Next slide. So descriptively, why should this matter to businesses? Well, we've talked about the workforce. Again, we look at the working age population, and over the next few decades, the working age population is going to be majority people of color. And we already hear a lot about a skills gap and about the kinds of jobs that will support a growing economy in the future and the kinds of jobs we want to have here in our states and in our country. And that requires levels of education. It requires a healthy workforce. We can look at consumer markets, expanding consumer markets to perhaps populations that have not been served in the past, and that's good for business. Greater productivity, less incarceration, good for our federal and state budgets, less social services spending, greater tax revenues as people become more productive, are able to earn more, and contributes to economic growth. Next slide. So we wanted to put some numbers around this. Are we talking about a small amount? Are we talking about a large amount? And in 2018, here's what we see. I mentioned this 2/3 income differential. If you were to close disparities and close this earnings gap, and look across the population of the United States, what you would gain in earnings amounts to $1 trillion. And translating that into GDP, or total economic output, it's $2.7 trillion out of about a $20 trillion GDP. So this is a very significant, you can call it an economic burden of inequities, or you can call it lost economic potential. A few other metrics then we translated that to is potential for another $800 billion in consumer spending, increasing federal tax and state and local tax revenues. Also looked at healthcare. If health averages were equalized, you would save on healthcare spending, and you could save up to $3.5 million in premature death due to different life expectancies. Also saving on corrections spending. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. Again, this is all in the context of what we know is happening demographically. The working age population is, as of 2018, was about 38% people of color. By 2050, which is when today's children will be in their prime working years, over the country, it will be at 54% of the working age population will be people of color. Next slide. So in turn, all of these numbers, absent any changes and closing of these gaps, become much larger out a couple of decades. And I'll just say a few things about this slide. The second item down, the $8 trillion, this is what we estimate to be the potential for additional economic output if we could create circumstances such that populations of color could really reach their potential just in terms of equalizing the averages. That's a 22% increase in GDP by 2050. And that $8 trillion is larger than the GDP of any country today except for the US and China. That's the order of magnitude that we're talking about. And if you keep your eyes open, you may see that $8 trillion figure cited in many different places now as this message is penetrating. The other thing I'll say is that, again, this work was done in 2018, and we know that a lot of things are a lot worse today in many ways than they were back then. We know that COVID has had a disproportionate impact on populations of color in illness and severity of illness and in death, unfortunately. And the economic impacts are hitting those, as normally happens in economic downturns, those vulnerable populations are hardest hit. So we haven't rerun these numbers since COVID, but we would call these numbers a floor. And we feel that we've backtracked some on some of the progress due to what's happened over the past year. So despite much increased, of course, awareness and appreciation of these issues, which I'm hopeful about. But, in terms of the disparities that we see, they're likely to get worse here before they get better. Next slide. All right, so this message has been spreading in an accelerating way certainly over the 10 years that I've been working on it. And we see the $8 trillion figure. We see this sort of economic message appearing in many places now. And I'll direct your attention to the stylized 8 in the middle. In fact, this is my water glass today. This is 8 Trills Pills, which is the name of a Pilsner beer, Crowns and Hops Brewing Company. Took that who was very active in promoting racial equity, took that as the name of a very good Pilsner beer. And so I count that as penetration. Okay, next slide. So what do we do? There's so many answers to that question. There are things that need to be done at the policy level, as individuals, in communities, within the business community, in a particular workplace or business, as business organizations, things that can be done in all of these domains: housing, education, health, criminal justice, employment. In our reports, we try to give examples of evidence-based policies or practices. And I'm going to turn it back over to Cynthia to talk about all of the excellent work that the foundation has been doing over the last few years in the area of what can we do.
Thanks, Ani. So you all just heard about the research, right? What Ani and her team did and really helping us to frame this, right? And so for the foundation, we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we actually put this to action? How do we actually take this insight and start to apply it not only to ourselves as a foundation in our individual strategies around making grant dollars and managing our investment portfolio, but also how do we start to bring this research and this lens to our broader community? So next slide, we've done it in a couple of different ways. We've been looking at our partnerships with our business communities and on the communities that we're actually in. So for instance, we have teams in Michigan and Mississippi, Louisiana, and New Mexico. And with those teams and in those communities, we're very deeply embedded, working with those chambers, working with the small businesses, working with the financial institutions and the nonprofit sectors and the public sector, and really bringing this lens together as we see our convening power, our influence in that work, really helping to drive that conversation. Internally, we've been over the last few years really looking at our internal policy and practices at the foundation as well. And like many of you, I know everyone's kind of in this interesting spot of looking at, how do we start to think about these moments of, these insights that we've all gleaned over the last year because of COVID, because of the Black Lives Matters uprisings. We're seeing these disparities play out in our modern society, and we can't turn away. And so for us at the foundation, it's been really exciting to work with a lot of our partners on the community workforce and economic development side, because we see the opportunity in working with different employers, workforce development organizations, and the public service or public sector as well. And I think most notably, even today, I think many of you may have seen President Biden signed an executive order around racial equity. So we're seeing it at a federal level and kind of really taking root across the country. And we're really heartened by that. But I want to talk about one area specifically that we are undertaking as a foundation. Next slide, please. So expanding equity is an initiative of the foundation, a partnership with a management consulting firm that really is looking at the corporate sector and specifically. So I think many of you, it's probably not lost on you that you think about the corporate sector, you think about the number of employees, and you think about how the corporate sector in particular influences the culture of our business and professional sectors, right? Whether it is in the tech sector, banking, housing, what have you, right? So with the idea of expanding equity is really just that, looking at these, working with these corporations, C-suite level and staff and throughout to really start to rewire their organizations, thinking about, where are our blinders? Do we really have a pipeline issue, or is it just us, right? Are we looking at the right networks, or are we just excluding people because of our own bias? But really taking these companies, and they're Fortune 500 companies. We were fortunate to start the pilot just before COVID started last year with about 6 different financial institutions and be able to move that forward into a full-blown pilot. Next slide, please. So we have also in our work at the Kellogg Foundation in our One Journey. This is a great resource that we have on our website. Maybe there's a link in the chat there. We can learn about just exactly some of the challenges that we had in embarking this, because we want to live we want to live what we're talking in terms of sharing practices. And so we've gone through it. We've brought in consultants. We've had those tough conversations, and we've looked and audited many of our policies and procedures. And we're excited to share those insights with you there. Next slide. We also have, in this great work that my incredible colleagues across the foundation have been doing over the last 25 years, have a number of resources that you could leverage. So from reports like what you just heard here today on the business case, but also just really around practices. One of our colleagues just did a great report on workforce development, and you're welcome to put that off our website as well. Other great partners and grantees like PolicyLink, Prosperity Now are also fantastic organizations that really can help you think about what are some best practices and what are folks testing out. Next slide, please. So our incredible president, LaJune Montgomery Tabron, has been inspirational to all of us, but to us here who are doing this work. And she talks about the unfinished business of reaching the hearts and minds and souls so that racial equity is broadly embraced by the majority of the population, and the prevalent belief that racial hierarchy isn't as at last overcome. So I think that resonates even more so today as you're seeing a lot of the challenges that our society is facing, but we're also heartened that we have taken these initial steps to think about how we actually do this work, right, and move to action. And I think as a part of a lot of the reconstruction of our country from COVID and from all of the new insights that we've learned about ourselves, we see a tremendous opportunity for growth and collaboration and continued learning in this space. And we really welcome you and anybody else who's interested in joining us in that. So thank you for the opportunity to share. And I think we're ready to take your questions. So I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ani and Cynthia. So enlightening. I'm interested to take a closer look at that One Journey resource that you mentioned. So now we do plan to take questions submitted through the chat. So if you haven't asked your question yet, please type it in now on the stage chat, which is at the right-hand side of your screen. And Janelle, I'll go ahead and let you handle the questions. Janelle?
Perfect. Yeah, definitely really interesting, and glad to hear that those online resources exist. We'll definitely be looking into those as we go forward with this conversation. One question that did come in, and I'm not sure you'll be able to answer this exact question, so I'm going to expand on it a little bit. So the question was, has data been aggregated or analyzed making a business case for diversity specific to Alaska's natural resource economy? So what I know about the report and the work you do, I'm guessing that has not yet been a specific focus, but I guess I'm curious if you know anything about the resource industry or Alaska, or if you could tell us more about kind of what industries have been a focus for this work.
Mm-hmm. Ani, you want to start?
The answer is none of the work that I've done has focused on that. In the particular places where we've done a place-specific business case for racial equity, we have looked at, for example, New Orleans. It is very much service industry, tourism, and many of the people working in those industries are people of color. And so you have issues like minimum wage, you have issues like that. Those industries represent money coming into those states from all over, that city from all over the world. And that state could be better supported by having those folks have closer to a living wage. So we've also looked at this in the context of skilled manufacturing and the need for those types of skills, which seem to be in short supply. We seem to hear about a skills gap. And so where are those workers going to come from? But, you know, in terms of the sorts of natural resources that you're talking about, I haven't specifically studied that. I don't know, Cynthia, do you know any more about?
The only thing that pops on, I mean, First Peoples Worldwide has done a lot of research around indigenous communities and natural resources. And then obviously it's implicit in there, but not to the extent that we've done this report, but it's definitely an area of opportunity. And I would also highlight, you know, in other sectors where there has been some research that's being conducted. So definitely in the investment sector. So we've been seeing a lot of great studies coming out of various schools, including Michigan, about just what we're learning about implicit bias, who's getting through, what the opportunity looks like. PitchBook has been doing a lot of great work on this and starting to talk about it within the investment space. We're also starting to see it in like in the food and healthcare space as well, especially as it translates into healthcare service delivery, as we've been understanding implicit bias. So I would encourage those of you who are on the phone, these are the conversations we need to start. We need to start digging in and really understanding low landscape and where those blockers are at in our individual communities. So appreciate the question, and it sounds like we've got some good follow-ups potentially there.
Mm-hmm.
We're happy to give you plenty of new ideas anytime. So the next question, I think, is one that probably is going to come up a lot as we're continuing this conversation, particularly in Fairbanks and interior Alaska. So the question is, zeroing in on recruitment, so, you know, having a more diverse employee base. Can you speak to diversifying your company's employee base when our industry's educational pipeline and our office geographic location are not particularly diverse? So if you're looking at hiring engineers, that's already not a very diverse population in a lot of ways. Or if you're looking at interior Alaska, we have, you know, different populations who live here, but when you compare it sometimes to a major urban area, you're not going to have as many different people to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to be the opportunity and the challenge. I think on our side, we see this pipeline question, and we quite frankly actually flip it back. We don't think it's as much of a pipeline issue as it really is a lens issue. It's really about how do you think about your recruitment, right? And how do you think about your jobs, how you're placing them, and your assumptions about your workforce? And so we really would encourage you to interrogate how you're thinking about that. Who are you recruiting from? Who are your recruiters? Who are your networks? You know, which schools or which organizations or trades are you recruiting from? If you have the opportunity to be remote, that is actually one way that we've seen a lot of folks really work through, you know, especially with a place like Alaska, remote and geographic issues. That's certainly an option. We've also had a lot of really great groups that have been popping up, really trying to illuminate just how you start to think about these different opportunities. So like the National Equity Project, which is a partner we've worked with over the last decade or so around our racial equity, has done a tremendous job across sectors, private and nonprofit, to explore this. So I think they could also be a great resource there as well. And I don't know if you had any doubts to add.
I would just add kind of broadly, I think of these things as a kind of short-term problem versus a long-term problem. And I think for an individual small business, I think it is hard to think about how to support making investments in improving that educational pipeline so that you end up with a greater, more diverse pool of people with a particular higher skill set that's going to take a while to build up. But maybe as an organization, as the chamber, as a part of a national industry organization, that's the place where maybe some policy can be influenced, or some investments made, or some public-private partnerships, or partnerships with education or with community colleges, being more proactive, I guess, rather than just saying, why isn't the workforce coming to us the way that we need it? Thinking about being more proactive, particularly for the long run. I would encourage thinking about it that way.
And Annie, you reminded me that thinking about, for instance, historically Black colleges and universities, recruiting from there, right? There are Native universities, Latino, right? So thinking about how you're diversifying your recruitment sources, those communities. We, for instance, have been kind of informally doing network audits, right? Making sure we're thinking about how we are sourcing, because we're looking for transactions to invest in. How do we source? How are we making sure we're not just going to the folks? And I think similarly, you have to think about that, right? Who is being left out when you're recruiting, right? Who's in and who's out?
Right, I'll add one more just quick example. It may not necessarily apply exactly what you're talking about in your circumstances in Alaska, but I guess it's an example of thinking about things a little bit differently. And there's a company called Cascade Engineering in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that is an example a lot. And they have dramatically expanded their pipeline and created a very loyal, hardworking, very productive workforce by tapping into populations that have had a hard time sometimes finding consistent employment. For example, the formerly incarcerated. They have many years of policies in place that give people a chance, look at the whole person, don't automatically exclude folks. They also reach out to single mothers who are on social assistance, and they understand that sometimes you have to put some supports in place to help people over the hump of childcare or transportation or just inexperience in a work environment. But if you put the effort in to do that, you're really expanding the populations that you can draw from, and you're creating, again, a very loyal, very productive, hardworking workforce. So that may not work for engineers, but it's just sort of, again, an example of a different way to look at who you're drawing your workforce from.
Well, and what you just said made me think about, we're in the position of we're currently hiring for 2 positions in our office, and it made me wonder, is the place where I, as a white woman, would look for a job different from where a Native woman or a Native man would look for a job, or someone of a different background. So it makes me wonder, are we posting our jobs in the right places to find those people? So it raises some good questions, I think, that we can all start thinking about.
That's great.
The only other question that I was going to ask, one thing that I think maybe people have a little bit of a hard time wrapping their mind around is this concept of helping to lay the foundation to allow people to live up to their economic potential. Because I think it's hard to envision, well, that's helping that individual, but how is that helping me as a business owner? Or how is that helping raise those GDP numbers or tax revenues or all those other numbers that you were talking about? So maybe you could talk just for a minute about how does that helping that individual translate to those broader economic benefits?
Sure, and that really is one of the key points that we're trying to make here. So if an individual or a group of people can have the opportunity to be healthier, to have a much lower probability of ending up behind bars and they're out of the labor force, unable to get the skills and the education that they need. If folks can reach their educational potential and can have the employment opportunities to really get a fast start and to succeed, and entrepreneurship. There's plenty of drive for entrepreneurship among populations of color. But is the financing there? Do they have access to banking? Do they have equity in a home, or any kind of a nest egg from family or from themselves to be able to get a loan? If you equalize all of those types of opportunities, then you're going to have people with greater incomes to spend in their communities and to spend in your business, and they won't need to be getting some support for some essential services from the state. They'll be paying tax revenues from the earnings. They'll be employing people from their businesses. I think of it as a part of the population that has to struggle much harder, and that is starting out from a different place and has remaining barriers in place. And if you can free that, then you'll have people with more skills, with better jobs, earning more financial stability, healthier, saving in healthcare spending, living longer lives, being a more stable contributing member of their community, less stress in their lives, less crime, just all across the board, just a better, more stable, more productive economy. And as people have more earnings, they spend more. So the whole economy grows. And I'll just make one quick point here, kind of a nerdy economic point, which is this is not just a thought exercise. When economists have studied the 50 years between 1960s and the early 2000s and looked at what contributed to economic growth in the United States during that period, what they found was they could attribute about 20% of that growth to expanded employment opportunities for Blacks and women. And so as those parts of our population were more part of the workforce, earning more, that contributed very significantly to our economic growth over those 50 years. So, we have a say in what's going to contribute to the economic growth over the next 50 years. It really can be impactful.
And I think for us, within our portfolio, because we only have, finite resources, and so we have to be really thoughtful about how we target, right? And so for us, we use what is known as a targeted universal lens, where we look at an issue in a system, right? So for instance, it's like home loans, right? Who actually can't get access to those home loans? And that's what we target. And we look at transactions that can help to wrap around that, where we can maximize the investment into that entity that's going to deploy those loans into those communities, but at the same time is sustainable. And so for us, the bank or whoever the lender for those organizations is getting great experience, connection, insight into those communities, and it's figuring out how to engage those communities, and that's market. And so we want to replicate that over and over again across market. And what it's going to be, this is the opportunity. This is where individually companies can go and do their own R&D. And some of them are already ahead, right? It's because some of you already are starting to think this way. You're already working in these communities, you're thinking about how do you diversify your recruitment. And so I think those are the practices I think are really starting to play out. And you're seeing a lot of different universities and schools and programs that are really developing insights and research that can help to guide folks. But I think this is one where obviously we will continue to be a resource with a guide and the great work that Ani and her team have been doing, and also really continuing to push the practice through our grantees, both in the state and beyond, and our partners up there as well.
Cool. Well, so I just want to leave with, there is a really good question still in the chat. We are getting very close to the end of the hour, and we do try to let people go so they can get to their next meeting after lunch. But I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe in a sentence or two, a lot of the folks who are here today are here, like you said, we're interested in this. People who are open to this idea of we want to make a change are the ones who are on today. So the question is, how do we get that message to the folks who maybe aren't naturally right now interested in that or wouldn't pick that as one of their top issues? So like I said, we only have a minute, but maybe if you just want to give them one website or one resource that you want to point people towards, so how do we get more people into that conversation? Sorry, it's a big question.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the goals of this business case for racial equity is just to get people to start to have that message penetrate people who maybe aren't hugely opposed to this, but just haven't given it much thought. So I feel like that's kind of our audience, is people who are sort of maybe neutral or slightly positive, but just haven't really thought about being proactive yet and the importance. And so kind of adding some ammunition and some motivation to that.
Yeah. This reminds me of, I don't know if any of you followed the climate change movement in some respects, because you had, that movement was not being accepted by anybody. And I know that's a rough conversation for Alaska, but I'm from up there, so I know the dialogue. But I think for the most part, the conversation switched when the business community realized that there was a lot of money that they were losing from the inefficiencies. And I think that's where we're at right now. People are realizing lawsuits cost money. COVID costs money. These systematic inefficiencies cost us a lot of money. How do we now reinforce our system that at the same time will therefore benefit this whole swath of people that have been overlooked or just not engaged in a thoughtful way? And I think what's nice about Alaska and your marketplace up there and your nonprofit community is that you've got organizations who are really deeply embedded and know these communities. Talk to them. they have the insights about these individuals that that you may need to hire that might be customers or partners for you. And they really have a lot of great insight, and the communities can tell you what the pulse is in the community. And so I would just really encourage that as well. And like I said, keep an eye out. My colleagues here are doing great jobs putting out some great resources and insights as we hear about them across the country. So we'll always be a great resource to you all and others.
Perfect. Yeah, and they've been putting links and things in the chat as we've been going through this. So that's all the questions we have time for. So I'm going to kick it back to Sabrina, and she'll take us out with the end of the meeting here.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Janelle. And thank you again to Ani and Cynthia for presenting to our membership. What an informative kickoff. I found myself taking notes the whole time. I think that we as a business community really have the opportunity here to move the needle on this. So I hope that the rest of our series will be as engaging as this one. And as always, thank you to our membership and community who have joined us today. Please join us next week for a presentation by Joni Simpson titled Career and Technical Education, the Pipeline to Alaska's Workforce. So thanks again for your attention to today's important program. Now let's get back to work, Fairbanks. Be well, everyone.